You're live.
Hello, fellow listeners. Welcome back to those who have been following us on YouTube, and a warm welcome to those here for the first time. Yes, you're right. It's another edition of Socialist Action Webcasts. My name is Elizabeth Byce, and I am the Federal Treasurer of Socialist Action and a member of the NDP Socialist Caucus Steering Committee. We acknowledge that this event is taking place on Indigenous lands across Turtle Island, known as North America. That includes the unceded territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Wendat, and Haudenosaunee people in the place called Toronto. Today, I'm speaking to you from Jamaica, where the indigenous Taino, Arawak-speaking people began arriving here 4,000 years ago, but were wiped out by European colonial powers. We join in the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no real reconciliation without restitution. That entails seizing the assets of the big resource corporations and returning them to the commons. Tonight's topic, James P. Cannon and the Foundations of Trotskyism, featuring Bryan Palmer, Emeritus Professor of History at Trent University, Ontario, and Jeff Mackler, a National Secretary, Socialist Action USA. Each of whom will speak up to 20 minutes. Then our discussant, Suzanne Weiss, author and activist who was the secretary to J.P. Cannon in the 1970s, will speak for 5 minutes. After that, we will take questions from the online audience. Our keynote speaker is Bryan Palmer, Emeritus Professor of History at Trent University, Ontario, and author of James P. Cannon and the Origins of the American Revolution, left 1890-1928. The forthcoming book, James P. Cannon and the Emergence of Trotskyism in the United States, 1928-1938, published Brill 2021. Also, Revolutionary Teamsters, the Minneapolis Trucker Strike of 1934, Chicago A Market 2014, and co-author of Toronto's Poor, A Rebellious History, Between the Lines. So welcome, Bryan.
Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth, and thanks to Socialist Action for inviting me. I'm going to just talk very, very briefly for about 20 minutes on Cannon, and I'd like to focus it around his importance as a red thread of revolutionary continuity. And that revolutionary continuity really, I think, has a number of dimensions. First and foremost is Cannon's historical placement in the sort of revolutionary tradition in the United States. His father had been a member of the and supporter of Debs and the Socialist Party at the turn of the century. Cannon himself moved out of the Socialist Party and into the Industrial Workers of the World, a revolutionary syndicalist organization, where he played a role as an itinerant agitator. But he moved with the understanding into the left wing of the Socialist Party at the time of the Russian Revolution and World War I, recognizing the limitations of the syndicalist practices, which had largely absented themselves from the necessity for political struggle, in spite of the considerable contributions they made in the fight at the industrial realm and at the point of production. With his entry into the left wing of the Socialist Party, Cannon and others around him gravitated with the Russian Revolution of 1917 and its immediate aftermath into an understanding of the necessity of forming a communist party. He was part of the communist underground, and played a fundamental role in leading the underground forces into an above-ground party formed in 1921, at which point he was the first chair. And he united a number of different factions and groups, including a number of foreign language federations, Jewish socialists, and native-born radicals. From that point on, he was a leading figure in the Communist Party of the United States, where he was one, I would argue, of the three major leaders of the party in the 1920s. each one almost with a kind of, in the highly factionalized nature of the party, and with its ongoing Stalinization, which was not really apparent to Americans like Cannon as it was happening in the mid-1920s, but became by 1928 more clear-cut to Cannon and others. Cannon led a group that was aligned around labor defense and trade union issues, although Cannon himself, coming out of a wobbly background, had not been actually a member of any American Federation of Labor Union. But he helped to found the International Labor Defense, which was the Communist Party's largest mass organization. He played a fundamental role in defending people like Tom Mooney, class war prisoners, others like Sacco and Vanzetti, and really a myriad of individuals who sort of came under the assault of state repression. It was in 1928, and Cannon had grown increasingly disillusioned with what he really did not understand, but which he grasped as the sort of inherent, ongoing, and debilitating factionalism of the Communist Party, which had been in many ways encouraged by Stalin, who liked to play one faction off against another, the better to consolidate his own Comintern authority over all national sections of the Communist International. And in the 1920s, Cannon had battled Stalinist emissaries like Joseph Pogany, who came from Hungary and was assumed the American name of John Pepper. And he fought for a different kind of party. He fought for a time within the CP for a faction to sort of end factionalism. In 1928, when attending a Communist International Congress in the Soviet Union, he came across Trotsky's critique of the Comintern's policies and was won over to Trotsky's position. Along with a Canadian, Morris Spector, he smuggled that document out of the Soviet Union, brought it back to North America, where he and Spector tried to organize a group to basically remain in the Communist Party, but to win the Communist Party away from its increasing reliance on socialism in one country rather than proletarian internationalism, to win it away from various opportunistic and adventurous policies. Stalinism tended to zig and zag from one to the other. With Max Shachtman, his life partner Rose Carstner, and Martin Abern, he formed a grouping of opposition, was almost immediately expelled, as were any number of supporters, and even people who were lukewarm about their support for Cannon and his project and this, new Trotskyist initiative, but who wanted to actually learn through a reading of the documents and a discussion of the issues, what the problems facing the Communist International and the American Party in particular were. This resulted in a heavy-handed Stalinist suppression and repression of such forces, who were also expelled and in some senses were driven into alliances and working relations with Cannon. This happened at a most inopportune moment, at the very point that, of course, Cannon and those around him decided to try to lead the struggle for the rebirth of revolutionary politics inside a degenerating Stalinist Communist International. The economy of the global economy collapsed. Particularly hard hit was the United States. It left most of the people that were working with Cannon struggling to find employment. Cannon and other professional revolutionaries aligned with him who had been reliant upon Communist Party payments for their work in the International Labor Defense and other organizations were left, penniless, and with the economy devastated, and with the Communist Party, the largest revolutionary organization, having long since displaced other alternatives in the syndicalist and socialist variants, being the sort of major game in town. The consequence was that it was extremely difficult to organize what the Cannon and his allies had set up as a really an external opposition, trying to still, although they had been expelled from the party, they were still trying to win members of the party to their position. This was the Trotskyist orientation, really from the late 20s into the early to mid 1930s. Finally, with the increasingly obvious incapacity of the Comintern to follow a revolutionary course with the rise of Hitler and the threat that fascism posed, Trotsky and his allies around the world broke from this policy of being an external faction of the Communist Party and struck out on their own, forming a distinct political current that, while it tried to, of course, continue to recruit members of the Communist Party and did so to some extent, it also struck out in new and independent activities. Increasingly, Cannon and others who went through a very difficult period of internal factionalism in the very early 30s, which left Cannon somewhat demoralized. Gradually, things improved as the economy in its downturn began to generate working class opposition. Cannon and the group that he had founded, the Communist League of America Opposition, fought on the side of hotel workers in New York City, fought with dissident miners in the progressive miners movement in Illinois, and most importantly, Trotskyists led the most successful and decisive mass industrial union mobilization in Minneapolis among Teamsters in 1934, where Trotskyist leadership spearheaded an immense mobilization that sort of broke the back of the sectionalism and conservatism of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters Conservative Union, and springboarded a union that had had 75 to 100 members in the early 1930s into a mass organization of over 7,000 by the end of 3 strikes that they led in 1934. This was happening at the same time that the Communist Party was playing a decisive role in leading a major strike on the San Francisco waterfront among the longshore unions, and where A.J. Muste and his Workers' Party were leading a strike among auto parts workers in Toledo. That upheaval in the class struggle galvanized Cannon and others to see the need to broaden further their political activity and to actually fuse with the Musteites and the Workers' Party, American Workers' Party, pardon me, to form the Workers' Party in 1936. And from that point, they followed their inclination to broaden further by entering into the Socialist Party and aligning themselves with Trotsky's advocacy of what was called the French Turn in 1936. That entry produced a number of splits away from them, but it also garnered them much support. And in a forthcoming book that I've done, that I'm impatiently awaiting the Historical Materialism book series to put out. It's been with them since 2019, sadly. I actually spend a great deal of time discussing the entry into the Socialist Party and how Cannon, virtually alone among the Trotskyists that made that entry, charted an extremely effective method of entry with the understanding of how an entry would work, how it would best be charted. We can talk about this in perhaps the discussion period, and how it would inevitably lead to the expulsion of the entryists on the part of the hierarchy of the Socialist Party. That indeed happened, and Cannon played a central role in the central role in establishing not only the Socialist Workers' Party in the United States in 1938, but also in working with Trotsky to build and establish the Fourth International later in the summer of 1938, pardon me. From then, Cannon was very quickly precipitated into a series of factional encounters. One of his oldest allies in the communist movement, Max Shachtman, broke from him in 1940 over the nature of the Soviet Union, which Cannon and Trotsky insisted on defending against U.S. imperialism, arguing that it continued to be a degenerated workers' state under Stalin's leadership, but one that required and demanded defense from U.S. imperialism. A further factional conflict erupted in 46, involving two figures, Albert Goldman and Felix Morrow, who broke discipline with the Socialist Workers' Party, were having discussions with Shachtman's Workers' Party, and were basically arguing against many of the fundamental tenets of democratic centralism. This was at a very difficult moment for the SWP, having following upon Cannon and 17 other Trotskyist militants in the Teamsters Union and leaders of the SWP who had been imprisoned under the Smith Act ostensibly for treasonous activities in the early to mid 1940s. And Cannon's final factional battle occurred in the early 1950s against a group led by Bert Cochran and Harry Braverman and others, who basically were of the view that the situation was so dire that it was necessary to basically, in many ways, liquidate a Trotskyist presence in the class struggle, and to align with all manner of progressives and indeed with Stalinists, because the prospects for revolution seemed so dim under the sort of dark clouds of McCarthyism. From that point on, Cannon played less of a direct role. He was more of a figurehead, moving into retirement. He and his partner Rose Karsner, I think, looked somewhat askance on some developments under the leadership of Dobbs, Farrell Dobbs, Tom Kemp, but more critically with the emergence of Jack Barnes as a figure of importance in the 1960s. He died in 1974. Was it 1973 or 74? In the early 1970s. And with his passing, United States had lost really one of the major figures of a native-born revolutionary who not only adhered to the internationalism of the early Communist International, but had the revolutionary integrity and courage to stand up against the degeneration of that movement under Stalinism. This notion of revolutionary continuity is, I think, in our time, of fundamental importance, because it has been essentially broken. We see now what happens when the revolutionary left is weakened to the point that it is really not the kind of major player that it was in much of the history of the 20th century. With the demise of the revolutionary left over the course of the last 3 decades and more, really almost, it's probably longer, I would say, from really the mid 70s and the accelerating crises of capitalism, the rise of neoliberalism, the assault on the revolutionary left, the continuity of the presence of that revolutionary left having been broken has left both the labor movement in its mainstream forms and political alternatives on the left weakened. And this really, we see this today, where I would argue that while the time is overripe for revolutionary resistance and for and calling into play the absolute necessity of the Revolutionary Party and its organization, which Cannon stood, unequivocally for the entirety of his adult life. Necessity of that Revolutionary Party, the impact it can have in the political sphere and in the important organizations of the working class, the trade unions. With the absence of a revolutionary presence, we really see the problems that develop, and we are essentially captive then, not even of reformism, but of the mainstream political parties. One sees this particularly in the United States, I think, where revolutionary organizations, ostensibly revolutionary organizations, have largely liquidated, and many have gone into the Democratic Socialists of America, which of course works within the Democratic Party. When upheavals within that party try to present a left face and to move that party to the left, as with the Sanders mobilizations, it's simply not a sufficient left presence to buoy up those sensibilities and inclinations, and we are left then with Biden as the last best hope, which is a pretty forlorn place to be. Cannon shows us, I think, and I've only been able to touch on this very, very briefly, but Cannon shows us a way out of that impasse, and his lessons of party building, of integrity, of the primacy of keeping alive the program of class struggle politics. They present for us in our time lessons and insights that remain to be picked up and lived upon. Thanks very much.
Okay. Thank you, Bryan. Our next speaker is Jeff Mackler, National Secretary of Socialist Action, USA. He was the SA candidate for Senate from California in 2006 and for President of the United States in 2016 and 2020. Jeff is the West Coast coordinator of the Campaign to Free Mahmoud Abu Jamal. He is on the steering committee of the United National Anti-War Coalition, the Northern California Climate Mobilization, and was a union activist with the American Federations of Teachers in Hayward, California. Welcome, Jeff.
Glad to be with you, Socialist Action Canada, Elizabeth, and our technical expert, Kurt. I'm deeply grateful to Bryan for laying out the history of Jim Cannon. This will mark my 60th year in the Trotskyist movement. I joined Cannon's party in the very early 60s. It came around in the late 50s. But I'm thinking to myself, why would supporters and members and newcomers to the socialist movement be at all interested in the history of Jim Cannon, a single individual? The answer is, as Bryan repeatedly said, the question of revolutionary continuity. Continuity with what? Well, Socialist Action in the United States and Socialist Action Canada have a modest project in mind. We want to make revolutions in our country. We want to take on the largest imperialist powers on the planet Earth and replace it with a revolutionary and democratic society, which for the first time in the modern era is ruled by a majority as opposed to a minority ruling capitalist class. What will it take to make the social revolution in the United States? Is our audience today listening to a bunch of nutcases fantasizing about how we're going to take on the most powerful army and police in the world, a capitalist class that controls the wealth, that has a multi-trillion-dollar budget, that spends more on the military than virtually the entire world combined? Is this audience living in a fantasy world, listening to old people like Bryan and myself talk about revolutionary continuity? Well, I don't think so. Well, let's start with in continuity with what? We're in continuity with the greatest event in human history. That was the Russian Revolution of 1917, over 100 years ago. Why is it relevant today? What do we have to learn from an event that took place more than 100 years ago? Let me give you some answers to that question. The first is, it wasn't a small revolution. It was a revolution in the largest nation on Earth that covered a sixth of the land surface of the planet. And it was a revolution that defeated one of the mightiest imperial powers, a czarist, capitalist, semi-feudal country that was nicknamed the prison house of nationalities. That is because it had conquered huge numbers of other nations and forcibly incorporated them into the borders of Tsarist Russia. What happened on that revolution? Well, just imagine Lenin and Trotsky sitting on the steps of the Winter Palace on the day that the revolutionary Soviets, workers' councils, took over the Winter Palace, captured the officialdom of the Tsarist Empire, and began writing up some draft programs for what they were going to present to the Soviet, that is the Council of Workers, Peasants, and Soldiers that was going to meet the next day. They drafted up some resolutions and brought them to the Soviet. That is a nationwide body that had existed under the Tsarist Empire and after the Tsar was overthrown in February 1917, of thousands of workers, peasants, and soldiers who considered themselves the new government of the new revolutionary state. What did they propose on day one? First thing they proposed was that the land of the Tsarist capitalist state be nationalized immediately and be turned over to the peasants of Russia, to the millions of peasants who had served as near serfs on Tsarist capitalist feudal land. They nationalized the largest nation on earth and gave the land to the 90% of the population that worked on it. That's an important lesson, because today there will be no important social change anywhere in the world unless those revolutionaries follow the revolutionary example of Lenin and Trotsky. That is, you can't make a revolution that's serious and ongoing in any poor and oppressed country, anywhere in Africa or Latin America, unless you follow the example of giving the land, taking it from the rich, the aristocratic capitalists who use it for their own purposes, and give it to the poor and oppressed. That's not just an idea. It's the only way to win the solidarity of a huge portion of the population for revolutionary change. So the land question was critical. And on day one, the new government, the Bolshevik government, Bolshevik is simply a word that in Russian means, in English means majority, because the Russian Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, won the majority in 1901 of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, which was the party of revolutionary workers, divided into two factions: the majority, the Bolsheviks, and the minority, in English, is the Mensheviks. So the Bolshevik Revolution on day one granted the land to the peasantry. What else did they do on day two and day three? They passed a decree and began its implementation to grant the right of self-determination for all of Russia's conquered peoples, for the 50 nations that the Tsarist Empire had conquered in imperialist wars and forcibly incorporated into their country, denied it their language, culture, resources, and everything else. And they declared that they had the right to leave at any time. Or, if they wanted, they could be part of the Union of Soviet Socialist republics that was in formation. That right of self-determination is among the most important issues of our time. You have huge portions of Latin America and Africa and Asia that are still under the control, neo-colonial control, of the major imperialist powers today, who appoint their governments, their dictators, exploit their resources. A revolutionary socialist program in the United States must stand for the right of oppressed nations to self-determination. Keep the U.S. imperialist hands out now. That's a central tenet of the American anti-war movement. We got that from the Russian Revolution that made it a fact of life. So that revolution is as relevant today as anywhere else. We are against U.S. coups and wars in Latin America, against Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua. We're opposed to the U.S.-backed coup in Bolivia last year. We are opposed to the U.S. conquest and slaughter in Iraq, the threats to take over Iran, the 11-year war conducted against Syria. In every one of those cases, you can't have a revolutionary party in the United States that supports its own nation's oppression of poor and oppressed people around the world. So the lesson of the Russian Revolution was self-determination, imperialist hands off, the right of poor and oppressed people to decide their own government. That's the best way to help those governments towards socialist revolution. On day one or two or three of the Russian Revolution, they passed resolutions and implemented them to open up the Tsarist archives, reveal all of the secret treaties that the Tsar had signed, imposing its will on poor and oppressed nations, dividing up the world, and abrogating every one of those treaties. The Russians said to the world, we want nothing to do with Tsarist control of China or Iran or any other nation on earth. We repudiate the imperialist treaties, pacts, and agreements signed by war, achieved by war by the imperialist nations. That's our program in the United States. We reject the forced treaties of the United States by sanctions. The United States government has troops in some 170 countries around the world. Occupying forces. It sanctions some 80 different countries in order to impose American economic interests on them. So the Bolsheviks, that is the Russian revolutionaries, who renamed themselves from the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party into the Communist Party a year later, they published the secret treaties and abrogated them. The next thing you might say is, well, what happened after they made the revolution? There was a special moment 2 weeks earlier where Lenin called together the party after they had won the majority in the Soviets, which were representative bodies elected by workers, soldiers, and peasants from across Tsarist Russia. And Lenin proposed to the Central Committee of the party that they make a revolution. That would be the equivalent of me saying to Elizabeth and Barry Weissletter and my friends, hey, let's make a socialist revolution tomorrow in Canada or the United States. Any sane person would say, you must be out of your mind. You're not a sane person. But that's the proposition that Lenin and Trotsky made to the party leadership that had won the majority of the working class peasants and soldiers in the country. A minority said, you're crazy. The Tsarist army is going to return, the imperialists are going to return, and we're going to go to jail the rest of our lives. That's what happens when you make a revolution. 2 weeks later, the revolution was successful. And they began to establish an army. The army of the Soviets was tiny. It was 5,000 people. And in a matter of months and the year ahead, the entire imperialist world, 14 countries, plus the Tsarist armies, invaded Russia to arrest and overthrow the revolutionary leadership, return the land to the capitalist class, maintain the imperialist colonization and interests, and the whole world invaded. What did the revolutionary Soviet do? It formed an army of 5 and then 10 million people. The army was joined by the peasants and the workers because for the first time in history, the peasants had the land and the workers had control of the factories, and they didn't want to go back to Tsarist capitalist exploitation. This Red Army was headed by Trotsky, and it defeated the combined forces of the entire world. Not so much by military. They did it by flying. They had planes that dropped flyers over the invading forces and said, workers who are invading our country, we've just made a revolution. The working class is in power, institutional power, through councils of workers elected and subject to immediate recall. Go home and make your own revolution. Give your own peasantry the land. Set up your own democratic institutions that advance the interests of working people, not the capitalist warmongering exploiters. Of course, this was a time when the great powers of the world on both sides, the Tsar was allied with the United States and in World War I with Japan, and England and France, and they were fighting against the Germans, Italians, and others in a war for the redivision of the entire world. The position of Lenin and Trotsky was, this is not our war. We start with the principle of Marxism in the Communist Manifesto. Workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. Not workers of the world, kill yourself for your own capitalist government who wants to conquer the world in the interests of capitalism. So the Bolsheviks, in short time, got out of the war, to the absolute horror of their allies among the British and the French. At one point in the early 1920s, both sides of the imperialist world of the war invaded Russia to overturn the Russian Revolution. So I have a few minutes left. We stand in continuity with the Russian Revolution. I set up a democratic society, not a Stalinist society. Stalin came to power in a faction fight that began with Trotsky, and Trotsky was allied with Lenin at that time in a fight to remove Stalin. Stalin came to power in the 1920s, 1923, 24. Trotsky, with Lenin, who died in 1924, formed an opposition. They fought for socialist democracy, which is what we fight for in the United States. For the first time in history, we want to construct a society where the working class rules in its own name through its own institutions, where production is to solve the interests of humanity, not capitalist profits, where if you automate a plant, you don't fire workers, you reduce the work week so everybody can have more leisure time to enjoy the world of science and culture and art, as opposed to the drudgery of factory and working class life in general. We live in a world where the capitalists are heading us for disaster with global warming, climate change, endless wars, and racist police attacks like we see in the United States. Derek Chauvin was convicted 2 days ago of murdering George Floyd. He was the only person ever convicted out of 378 murders in Minnesota ever convicted of murder. 1% of the police murders are ever convicted of anything in the United States. The other 99% in this racist prison industrial complex, privatized for-profit near-slave labor prison industry, the rest of the murdering cops go free. But we want to build a new world. It's predicated on the Bolshevik proposition that we can win a majority, that the vast majority of the working class has the power to close this down, that the workers who are drafted into the army, the economic draft, have no interest in fighting poor and oppressed people anywhere in the world. We want to bring them home. We want to build a society where global warming doesn't threaten our lives, if not the planet itself, in 10 years. So we stand in continuity with Cannon's party. Every idea I mentioned was championed by Jim Cannon and the party he built in 1938, the Socialist Workers' Party. Tragically, that party is a shadow of itself and has rejected Jim Cannon's ideas and Trotsky's ideas. The reason is simple. The life of a revolutionary, whether it be Marx or Engels, who we stand in continuity with, or Jim Cannon or Lenin and Trotsky, is not an easy life. It's not an easy life to take on the state power, to devote yourself to humanity's interest when it doesn't appear to have an echo in the population. But those ideas that I mentioned, the simple idea that the working class should rule, that the working class should have its own parties, independent of and against the parties of the capitalists, that revolutionaries never support the Democrats or Republicans or any other party that supports capitalism. Fundamental ideas that underpin our lives, our future, that explain how we can win, not by a coup, not by a conspiracy, not by individual acts of terror, but by organizing the working class to defend its own interests. Today, the working class has never been more powerful in the United States, physically speaking, to do that. What we face is an unprecedented crisis of leadership, of bureaucratized trade unions and social organizations that are subordinate to the Democratic Party. Join us. Join Socialist Action in the United States and in Canada, our sister party. We're growing organizations that are recruiting the best fighters for the future. We're optimistic. We're not crazy people looking back 100 years ago. We deal with the immediate problems in front of us: racism, poverty, unemployment, sexism, destruction of unions and pensions. We fight for better lives for working people. We fight in every struggle of working people seek to join together in independent actions to advance their own interests. That's what this program is really about. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. Our next speaker is Suzanne Weiss. She's an international solidarity activist in Toronto and is the author of Holocaust to Resistance. As a member of the Socialist Workers' Party in the U.S., she was secretary to James P. Cannon from 72 to 1974. Welcome, Suzanne. Unmute yourself, dear.
Oh, darn it.
You're okay. You're on.
Okay. Hi, Elizabeth. Thank you very much. And thank you, Bryan, and also Jeff. I met James P. Cannon in 1960 when his partner, Rose Kastner, invited me to their home for a chat. Jim gave a cordial hello and listened a while Rose asked me about my student activism for Cuba and Black freedom. She was also interested in my background, which was similar to hers, the Jewish community in Eastern Europe. Rose was highly regarded by the party as one of its founders and as a serious organizer, well-versed in the theories of Marx. A decade later, I served Jim Cannon's personal secretary. Rose had recently died of cancer. The impact of this blow was of great concern to Jim's comrades. They convinced Jim to review his life's works in speeches, writings, and letters, which were consequently published in several volumes. I was the fourth person to serve as his full-time assistant. In addition, two male comrades lived with him and provided companionship in the evenings. When I joined the household, Jim was 82, physically frail and suffering from emphysema. He exuded an air of dignity. Visitors came from time to time, and Jim greeted them with pleasure. He was glad to hear reports of developments in his party. He welcomed varying points of view. Jim, first and foremost, championed the working class and its international efforts. In his conversations, Jim seethed over the crimes of capitalism. He watched the Watergate corruption scandal, which led to Richard Nixon's demise. He cheered Nixon's downfall, and even more, the way the disgrace exposed the deceptions of the supposedly democratic political apparatus. Jim bemoaned Israel's mistreatment of the Palestinian people. What a terrible turn Israel was foisting on the Jewish people. In their name, the Israeli government was abusing the calamity of the Holocaust and acting criminally against the innocent Palestinians and Arab people. Jim no longer had the energy to review his remaining personal papers, But he agreed to be interviewed by Harry Ring, a party writer and activist who Jim had known since the 30s. The articles were published as a series. Jim saw them as a link with young activists. He was gratified by the leading role his young comrades took in social movements, particularly against the war, in the Black Freedom Movement and women's liberation. To gain more insight into the man, Harry tried to get Jim to talk about himself, but Jim was reticent. Finally, Jim softened a little and mentioned a number of small personal incidents highlighting his own inadequacies and regretting his own behavior. He liked to repeat the dictum, "Man, know thyself." And then he would add, "Man, forget thyself." I identified with that. It threw light on the unselfish focus in his dedication to improve the human condition. Jim's books, articles, and speeches are guides to apply Marxism's dialectical method in the US and Canada. It was an honor to have had a close link with this great giant of labor and socialism. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. Okay, so now, and thank all of you. And now with the help of our technical producer, Kurt Young, we'll hear some questions from our online audience. We will take 3 questions at a time and then call on our panelists to respond to one or more of the questions as they choose. So Kurt, it's over to you.
I lost it.
Oh, just give me 1 second. All right. So Mark Kozatsky asks, is it fair to say that little is left of Cannon's heritage? Look at Jack Barnes and the Socialist Workers' Party of the USA. Alex Badilla asks, what major lessons can James P. Cannon's life teach us here in the present? And Julius A. asks, James B. Cannon's influenced parties based in North America have not grown and had as much influence in the Trotskyist movement around the world today as much as British and Latin American Trotskyism. Is this a reflection of Cannon's ideas or the lack of radicalization of the North American working class, or is it something else?
Okay, so we're going to go to our panelists, and we're going to start with Bryan, then Suzanne, and then Jeff. And you each have up to 6 minutes. Bryan?
Okay, well, on the Socialist Workers' Party in the U.S. And whether or not it represents a continuity with Cannon, I would argue that it represents a decisive break from Cannon. And there have been many, many indications of this since, I would say, the mid to late 1960s and, through the 70s and 80s and up to the present. Many individuals who were, I would argue, very much the continuity of the Cannonist Party were either expelled by the Socialist Workers' Party or split decisively from it. I think the fundamental point to make about the current Socialist Workers' Party is that it has, in fact, broken from Cannon's commitment to the working class within the United States as a fundamental agent of revolutionary transformation, potentially a revolutionary agent of transformation. As I understand the Socialist Workers' Party at its current juncture, it has largely, I would say, collapsed into a group that supports the Cuban Revolution and it has, in some senses, eliminated the commitment to, or backed away from the commitment to the revolutionary potential of the American working class. It does not, in my view, represent a continuity with Cannon. My screen is moving, and I can't quite get. There was a. Could someone repeat the second short question?
Alex Padilla asks, what major lessons can James P. Cannon's life teach us here in the present?
Well, I think that the major lesson that it teaches is the absolute necessity of revolutionary organization. This is what Cannon dedicated his life to. He swam against many streams. It was an uphill battle. He was not only running headlong into the opposition of capitalists, employers, and the state that serves their interests. He was running headlong into reformist organizations like the leadership of the Socialist Party, and of course the Stalinist control over the Communist International. He saw the need for building a revolutionary party that was, as Jeff and I have both accented, very much in the tradition of Marx and Engels and Lenin and Trotsky. This is an uphill fight. It's a very difficult. The entire sort of hegemonic apparatus of capital is weighs against this. He dedicated his life to building it. And I also think that in spite of, or perhaps as a reflection of, the way he dealt with the factionalism and differentiation within the revolutionary movement that has always been a component of Trotskyism's day-to-day experiences. How Cannon handled those factional confrontations. He didn't always, in my view, do everything absolutely right, and one would not expect that anyone would be faultless in these situations. But if you read The Struggle for a Proletarian Party, which is about the major faction fight that where he confronted the Russian question or the nature of the Soviet Union when Shachtman broke from him. If you look at the documents there, you see repeatedly a willingness to engage with arguments, differences, policies, and to hammer them out in a way that is structured around a full airing of difference based on fundamental principles, and using those factional encounters, which are part of party building that organization that's necessary and that's steeled in the program and the approach of its revolutionary cadre. How Cannon dealt with that, and it is revealed very much in that book, The Struggle for a Proletarian Party, is very much one in which there is a full airing. This is antithetical to the kind of Stalinist suppression of full debate and discussion. That is something that we have to learn from Cannon. And then to go to Suzanne's question, Cannon, another favorite saying of Cannon's that I never met him, but that I have seen repeated in some of his more personal writings, is that he had this humility about himself, and he took that into how he handled. It took him a long time to learn this, but he took it into how he handled differences within the party. He didn't want the party strangled over differences that actually were not necessarily differences of principle.
30 seconds.
Yeah, he had this. He had the saying, "A man should be measured by the merits of his defects." By that he meant, you look at someone in their worst moments and see how they handle what's coming at them and how they're addressing this to comrades and other people. And I think that in the end, that was something that we can all learn from as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Bryan. Suzanne? Unmute yourself.
I'm not an expert like Bryan Palmer, and I really appreciate that he's written books about Jim's canon. And I'm not a leader such as Jeff, but I am a soldier of the revolution, as such as it is. And the way I look at James P. Cannon is that with all he wrote and all he did, what he attempted to do was teach us some lessons of how to act and lead in the working class. I would like to refer to Socialism on Trial, which is an exemplary book on lessons that we need to learn. And we have mass movements that come up and some go down and then they come up again. But the most important thing is that we learn that what they are fighting for is their rights, their democratic rights. They did not look at the Russian Revolution as an insurrection. They looked at it as workers fighting for their rights. And that's what they're doing today. And so we need to understand that they are fighting for the democratic rights and that they need to organize workers' defense in order to be effective in fighting for the democratic rights, and we need to help them in that struggle. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. Jeff?
You know, Cannon once said, one of my favorite Jim Cannon quotes, that if he ever got a medal for his contribution to the revolutionary movement, if I ever got a medal, he said, it won't be for anything I did, it would be for all the shit I had to listen to. And there's an element of truth in that. You know, I'm reminded of Lenin in 1917. And here you are, I mentioned 1917 again, and you think I'm referring to the Russian Revolution. No, Lenin was rowing a boat on a Swiss lake in January 1917. And he lectured to a bunch of university students there, saying, I'm an old man. And an old man, he was in his 40s. I'm in my 80s. And he said to the students, I'm an old man. I won't be around for the revolution. But you, young people, you're the future of humanity. That was in January 1917. In February 1917, a month later, the Russian workers organized, mobilized, and threw out the Tsar. And Lenin headed back to Russia. Trotsky was in exile in New York, editing a Russian language publication in the Bronx. And he got on a boat to Canada, had to fight his way, and got back to Russia. That was in February. 6 months later, they won the majority of the Soviets, the working class, and the soldiers, and the peasantry, and made a revolution. So you went from a time where revolutionaries thought it was impossible to a short few months later when millions were in action defending their own rights and made a socialist revolution. Can't make a revolution in the United States, people said, but when cops murdered George Floyd last summer, An estimated 20 million people took to the streets, led by blacks, Black Lives Matter, but supported by millions of white working class youth in solidarity with the struggle for equality and black freedom. They shook this country to its core. But because there was no leadership, that movement was taken into the Democratic Party to support a capitalist, racist, imperialist Joe Biden for the presidency. The capitalist press makes out Joe Biden to be some kind of liberal. He was the representative of the Southern racist bigots in the South, the segregationists, who the Democrats had a partnership with to run the country for decades. The Democrats are the former party of the American slavocracy. Biden was a supporter of the Southern racist Democrats and its top leader, Strom Thurmond, who Biden spoke at his memorial meeting. And he was a warmonger, along with the Obama administration that conducted 7 simultaneous wars. So that movement, because there was no leadership, went into the Democratic Party, only to come out just recently with the murder of one youngster, 20-year-old Dante Wright, in Minneapolis, and tens of thousands came out into the street. And the world cheered with the conviction of Derek Chauvin. And everybody said, you'll never stop police brutality. But a frightened capitalist class in 40 states passed 140 laws supposedly restricting the rights of police to murder people and declaring a bit more democratic rights. That came when 20 million were in the streets. The people who voted for Trump were basically saying to the Democrats, you've offshored our jobs, you've automated our factories and closed them down, and you're Democrats, so we're going to vote for whoever is not a Democrat. So they voted for Trump, a right-wing reactionary moron president. Trump is gone and Biden is now in power, incapable of changing any fundamental aspects of capitalism. The working class are angry and they're looking for an alternative leadership. That's what 20 million told us. That 20 million people was the largest demonstration in the history of the United States. Until the mass mobilizations in India, which had over 100 million, there had never been a larger coordinated mobilization than last summer. And that was repressed by the United States government, who was fearful that it could get out of control. But once again, what was missing was the leadership. Leadership is critical. Lenin had built that leadership in exile in every country in the world and inside the borders of Russia, underground, under the most difficult conditions. But that leadership was able to coalesce in a short period of time because its roots in every struggle. I'm talking the struggle against the persecution of Jews under Tsarist Russia. I'm talking about the persecution of students who were protesting on campus, workers, peasants, soldiers, LGBT people, women. The revolutionary leadership of Lenin and Trotsky championed every social struggle. Yes, the SWP is no longer a revolutionary party, the party that Cannon founded. That's so unusual. The struggle to build a revolutionary party in non-revolutionary conditions is difficult. But keeping alive that core, that cadre, that continuity that has the ideas of Cannon, that's what's critical. Without those ideas, you can't make a revolution. Ideas are critical, and they have to meet the test of time. But they're basically simple ideas. You support the struggles of the oppressed. You oppose racism, unemployment, poverty, oppression, police murder, endless wars, climate catastrophe. Those are all inherent in capitalism. They have never been challenged by any capitalist party, and they won't be. That's our job. And we will find an echo like Cannon did, and Lenin, and every other revolutionary. We will find an echo. Marx built the
30
first,
seconds, Jeff.
Marx built the first international. which went by the wayside. But his co-thinker, 100 years after the Paris Commune in 1889, Engels, started a second international, and Lenin a third, and Cannon and Trotsky a fourth. Each generation carried the basic ideas of Marxism: majority rule, working class power, opposition to all the horrors of racist, sexist, warmongering, imperialist capitalism. Socialist action is the continuity of the SWP. We were expelled because we fought for Trotskyism. We fought for the lessons of the Russian Revolution and Lenin. That's what Cannon did. That's what we do.
It has to wrap up, comrade.
That's what SA Canada does. Join us.
Thank you, Jeff. Okay, so we're going to go back to Kurt for 3 more questions. Kurt?
Okay, so our first question comes from Barry Weisletter, who asks, in light of his experience with the degenerated and super-centralized Comintern, what was Cannon's approach to building the Fourth International? John Orrit asked, do you think that socialist action is following the course and thoughts of J. Cannon that you indicated were important? Tom Baker asks, how do we encourage revolutionary activists and labor militants to study our class history of struggle and to participate in building a revolutionary party?
Okay, so we're going to go back to our panel, which will start with Jeff, then Suzanne, then Bryan, and you each have up to 6 minutes. Jeff? 6, just 6 minutes.
Jeff, you're muted.
Good questions. To Tom Baker's question, how do we encourage revolutionary socialists to study our class history? First, we have to meet them. We meet them by going into the street, by initiating or joining the actions where they're struggling, by talking to them individually, by selling them our revolutionary press, by connecting our ideas with their own struggles and winning them to the party and teaching them the history of that party. As far as John Orrit is concerned, we're following the traditions of Cannon by building a revolutionary party under difficult circumstances, but at a time when, barring our inability to get out into the streets as much as we want because of COVID-19, pandemic that has killed almost 600,000 people in the United States, the largest number in the world. The United States, the most advanced capitalist country, has a medical care system that leaves us with a number of dead and afflicted that is the highest in the world. How do you account for that contradiction? Whereas a tiny country like revolutionary Cuba has the lowest infection rate and numbers of dead because they made a revolution that ended capitalism and granted free healthcare and quality education to everybody on the planet. As far as Barry is concerned, his question on the degeneration of the super centralized Comintern, it wasn't just because Stalin was an evil man. That's just part of the problem. The Russian Revolution, the first on the planet, paid a terrible price in being the first, and not in the most advanced capitalist country, but in one of the poorest, where as opposed to the working class being a vast majority, it was just 10% of the population. The miracle of the revolution was that it fought off and defeated the combined forces of the entire imperialist world. But it paid a terrible price. Its infrastructure was destroyed by imperialist embargoes and armies. Under these terrible conditions, a fight developed inside the Russian party. Stalin said, we had enough of revolution. Let's just make deals with imperialism. We won't make revolution in their country. We won't advocate it, and they'll leave us alone. We'll just have peaceful coexistence with the imperialist beast. Whereas Lenin said the future of humanity is building an international party, supporting the struggles of workers everywhere, making our revolution the beacon of the future. And under the terrible conditions of poverty and disease that took the lives of tens of thousands, and the defeats of other revolutions when German workers and Hungarian workers rose up, under those conditions, the Stalinist bureaucracy was able to achieve a majority in the party. And when it did, it ruthlessly rooted out, and Stalin actually murdered almost every member of the Central Committee of Lenin's party. But that was because of a defeat. Today we live in a different world, a world where a revolution in the most powerful capitalist country on earth, in the United States, can fundamentally alter all humanity. Building the Revolutionary Party in the United States is critical. We can win the working class, starting in small numbers. We're in the hundreds, and then the thousands, and then the millions. But when those big events happen, if we have a deeply rooted revolutionary party that has won its spurs with working people who are fighting for a better world, that party can, in a matter of moments, like Lenin's party and Trotsky's party, transform society and usher in a new world. That's the vision of every revolutionary. Marx's ideas are still around today because they correspond to the interests of workers everywhere. And yet Marx was forced out of his own country to live a life of exile, to try to build an international with small forces. But his ideas endure because they correspond to the interests of working people. That's what a revolutionary socialist program is. It's not a bunch of abstract ideas or principles or Cannon's books, which incorporate all of the lessons. Cannon's books are an explication of the experiences he had in building a revolutionary party. Bryan outlined them beautifully, and how to handle faction fights, how to respect differences in the party, how to grant automatically minorities representation in the party leadership as opposed to shunning them, how to organize united front democratic mass action coalitions of everyone to fight. We in the United National Anti-War Coalition of the United States, UNAC, have 150 different organizations working together in opposition to all U.S. wars abroad. We support the right of self-determination, and we've organized demonstrations of 300,000 people. We've had demonstrations for Mumia Abu-Jamal, perhaps the world's most renowned, free, innocent prisoner, of 25,000. We helped build demonstrations on the climate crisis of 400,000 in New York City and 10,000 in California. We support the freedom of Julian Assange, the epitome of
30 seconds.
The epitome of a man struggling for a free press and free speech. We champion every one of these struggles. That's how we build our party. So the revolutionary continuity exists in socialist action, in our cadre, in our members, and most important, in the combination of those with our revolutionary program.
Thank you, Jeff. Suzanne?
Thank you. I think that the class struggle is ever changing. It changed when Jim Cannon was alive, and it's changing now. And we can learn from the class struggle. We can learn from the various mass movements. And the party that wants to lead the revolution will not lead the revolution unless it makes liaisons, connections with the leaders of the mass movements and works with them to help them and to them to help the party as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. Bryan?
Okay, well, to Barry's question, which is a very, I think, important question. It needs to be remembered that Cannon came out of the Communist International. He came out of the Communist Party, and he'd seen really the most egregious Stalinist machinations against any kind of party democracy and any kind of communist independence within the United States. There was a great joke that circulated among the Communist Party figures in the 1920s. Why is the Communist Party like the Brooklyn Bridge? And the retort was, because it's suspended on cables. And what that meant is that even when the party would meet to actually elect its own officials, a cable might come from directly from Moscow through one of Stalin's emissaries, dictating that the election that had just been held had to be overturned. This left Cannon and many others demoralized. It ruined leaders who were, had decisive potential, like William Z. Foster. Foster became basically crippled in his capacity to lead, a figure who had led great strikes and had many connections to militant workers, was reduced basically to basically a cipher of Stalin. Cannon had lived through that, and when he actually was moving to create the Trotskyist movement in the U.S., and before he'd met Trotsky, he had a few points in time in the early to mid 1930s when he was communicating with Trotsky about certain issues. And he pressed Trotsky. He tested Trotsky, as he said in his own words, that when that there wasn't going to be a situation in which the American movement was simply to kind of jump when its foreign leader cracked the whip. And he challenged Trotsky on how Trotsky was behaving and interacting with figures like B.J. Field, who had been expelled from the Communist League of America opposition. And Trotsky passed those tests because, well, Trotsky could be on occasion imperious and demanding. He understood fundamentally as well, and he had a great deal of authority behind him to be imperious and demanding as well. But he had the fundamental understanding that you couldn't run an international like that, the way that Stalin had run it. So Cannon not only saw an international that needed to be less bureaucratic, less super centralized, less sort of following the orders from its center. He wanted what the early Comintern had been, which is that an amalgam and a confederation of organizations that looked to a leadership that had, because of its experience and because of what it had built, a certain authority. But that authority then also had to translate into a willingness to interact with and work with and develop leaderships in other national sections in a manner that respected in some senses, the autonomy of those national sections. And that's the kind of Fourth International that Cannon wanted to build and that he struggled to build. To Tom's question about how you encourage revolutionary activists and labor militants to study this history and to struggle and participate in building a national party, I think that what we have to recognize is that we are today in circumstances actually much worse than anything Cannon faced, and anything that any revolutionary leader faced over the course of much of the last century. We are, in terms of the situation of the revolutionary left right now, in, I would argue, the worst situation we have ever been. And Stalinism has played a role in this. The restoration of capitalism in Russia has played a role in this. The particular problems that are associated with the deformed worker states played a role in this. The demise of the revolutionary left through its implosions internally and through its repressions externally plays a role in this. And in that sense, I would argue that the only way that the revolutionary left can, in fact, encourage revolutionary activists and militants in the labor movement to come together is to be engaged in a regroupment of those forces on the revolutionary left, as weak and as fractured and as differentiated as they now are. Try to regroup what is there. Try to have that kind of regroupment. And Cannon did this in the 30s with his fusions with the Mustyites and with his, I would argue, with his understanding of limited shorter term entry into organizations like the Socialist Party. That's what he was trying to do, is regroup a revolutionary left. That's what I think is desperately needed in our times. Regroup that revolutionary left, provide a pole that can actually intersect adequately with mass movements which are emerging and which are really recognizing that this system is overripe for revolution. But there is, as Jeff pointed out, a lack of revolutionary leadership. We need to consolidate what is there in order to build the possibilities that we can draw more to our ranks and create really a Bolshevik party, a majority party, if not in the strict sense of a majority, in the sense of a mass party that can actually be a combat party and intersect with workers and activists in social movements. Thank you.
Thank you, Bryan. Okay, so we're going to go back to Kurt for the last three questions. Kurt?
So our first question comes from Rod McBean, who asks, James Cannon was kind of aesthetic. That means he purposely led a hard life so that he would be ready for difficult revolutionary times. Do we need to be aesthetic today to prepare for revolution? Barry Weisletter asks, as a former Wobbly, what did Cannon see as the fatal flaws of anarcho-syndicalism? And Alex Badilla asks, what actions can the remaining revolutionary left take to keep the spirit of James P. Cannon alive?
Okay, so we'll go back to the panelists. It would be Bryan, Suzanne, and Jeff. And this time, because of time, I can only give you 4 minutes. So please stay within the 4 minutes. So Bryan, you're first.
Yeah, on Cannon's asceticism, I disagree with that somewhat. I think, like all revolutionaries of his generation, he was in some sense disdainful of material possessions. He was a revolutionary. He committed himself entirely to the revolution. And he had, in some senses, a structure, a party, a movement that allowed him to do this. And that, in fact, from his days in the Communist Party and then later from his time within the Trotskyist movement, the party supported its leadership, a professional leadership. Was he in a set? He enjoyed. Cannon was actually a sensualist. He enjoyed good food, good drink, and good comradeship. I don't think I wouldn't want to make too much of a case for embracing asceticism, and I think he would have actually never seen that as what needed to be embraced. Alex's position: what actions can the remaining revolutionary take? I think, in some senses, I just revert back to my earlier answer. I think we need to regroup the revolutionary left. I think we need to regroup to build it as big and as best as it can be, and that through caucuses in the trade unions, we can help to rebuild the labor movement, which is faltering because this is a reciprocal demise of the labor movement and the revolutionary left. One has always, in some senses, built the other. As for Cannon and anarcho-syndicalism, I think the Cannon left anarcho-syndicalism in its best variant, the industrial workers of the world, because of the failure of the Wobblies to actually intercede effectively during World War II, during World War One. That is, they did not recognize significant numbers of Wobblies did not recognize the sort of political significance of the Russian Revolution and taking state power in terms of in the name of the working class, and in the repression of World War I domestically, the Wobblies did not actually have a coherent political position on how to fight that repression, which, as Suzanne mentioned earlier, Cannon later laid out brilliantly in his Socialism on Trial book, providing a kind of blueprint of how one should conduct labor defense in the midst of repression. But the Wobblies didn't do this in 1917. There were 3 major criminal syndicalist trials going on, and each one of them took a different kind of approach to their defense, including one in Sacramento in California that opted for a silent defense, saying nothing in the face of the state. So really, it's the political blind spot of anarcho-syndicalism, the need to intervene politically and to fight on the political level as well as the industrial. That was Cannon's major contribution in terms of seeing the flaws of revolutionary syndicalists, who, you know, in their IWW forms were among the best that the world has seen. Thanks.
You're muted, Elizabeth.
Suzanne?
Thank you, Elizabeth. I liked Bryan's answer to the wobbly issue. I wholeheartedly agree with him. I don't think that James Cannon was an ascetic. He was wholly in love with the work he was doing as a revolutionary, and he lived with what was necessary for him and nothing else. That he didn't need anything else. That's what made him happy. And as far as I got this thing. Hold on a second. Oh, actions remaining for revolutionaries, I would like again to stress that Cannon left us a whole number of lessons that we can learn from his books. And I feel that we have not really focused on those lessons. I feel that the left has mostly been involved in puffing itself up as leaders and not as interested in what the working class has to teach their party. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. Jeff?
Thanks, Elizabeth and Socialist Action Canada. This has been a great discussion. On the question of aestheticism, Cannon grew up in the revolutionary movement at the time of the Great Depression, where very few comrades had much in the way of material security. At one point, at the darkest time, he quit and took a job, lived out in Long Island, relatively, he was poor, had to support his wife and kids, and backed away from activity. The material conditions were difficult, but he never advocated that. Following World War II, the United States emerged as the most powerful imperialist nation on earth. It was the only nation that was untouched by the war. All the other competitors were destroyed, our enemies and allies alike, Japan and Germany, France and England, whereas the industrial capacity productive capacity of the United States was untouched, and there was a period of relative prosperity. I was part of that prosperity. I was able to get a job as a teacher at $4,900 a year, which was enough to live on. I came to California with my wife, who was a teacher, and we were able to save one income for a year and buy a modest house. That's what all of our friends were doing, and other teachers and working people in general. So revolutionaries don't measure their capacities by how poor they are or how much they restrain from having a decent meal, having a drink, having friends, having a social life. We want to interpenetrate with the whole working class in comradely exchanges, socially and politically. On the question of regroupment, I agree with Bryan, but only in the abstract. There will be a regroupment of the revolutionary left in the future, but the history of regroupment is that the most successful efforts were made when organizations found themselves in common struggle, when they joined together to fight the boss on a picket line, in a mass protest, in a united front. In fact, the united front is the most critical means to test the merits of other groups. We say, let's all mobilize in the streets, bring out our constituencies, our friends, to defend this strike or to build a mass movement to bring the troops home. And in the course of that, the best fighters will come together and find that they have more in common than they do the programmatic differences. But in history in general, the best and most long-lasting regroupments, as opposed to those that disintegrate shortly after, are ones that are born in struggle. The regroupments that Bryan mentioned with the Mustyites in 1935, 6, or 7 took place because the Mustyites led a great strike in Toledo, and the Trotskyists led a great strike, one of the greatest in history, in Minneapolis. Fusions take place when people find themselves in common struggle, the same way a party does. So the United Front is our method of testing the merits of other groups. We want to build broad, democratic, inclusive coalitions, open to everyone, all currents and all individuals, democratically run, one person, one vote, with mass meetings. Those are working class traditions. So I think that that kind of regroupment will come in the current period as the best fighters find themselves together. As far as the labor movement today, Bryan is right. It's at a low point. We have to rebuild it. 11% of the entire working class, the lowest percentage in the modern era. Our unions today, and ever declining. 90% are not in unions. We're going to see a period of working class upsurge where people join unions, not led by the current bureaucracy, but led by fighters who mobilize workers against the boss. As far as the anarchists are concerned, there are no serious anarchist currents today. Young people who are ignorant of revolutionary history run around saying they're anarchists. But the same anarchists turn out and support the Democratic Party. That's what happened with the Occupy movement. The vast number of people who thought that the individual occupation of a park or a building was a substitute for building a revolutionary party, most of them ended up supporting the Democrats in the election at that time. I don't think there's any future for the anarchist idea. Politics are critical. If your politics meet the needs of the working class, which is for unity, not only at the point of production, but in the political arena. We want to challenge the duopoly of politics in America, where two capitalist parties determine everything. We want to build a mass working class party, a labor party based on fighting unions.
30 seconds.
to represent workers in the political arena. We don't shun politics or political action. Bryan gave a few examples. There are many, many, many more. So the idea that you live an anarchist, ascetic lifestyle, go up into the countryside somewhere and build a commune and refrain from political activity, intercourse with mass organizations and working people is just foolish. The IWW of the 20s was a qualitatively different organization. They organized mass strikes against the working class. They organized strikes for free speech. They united workers in struggle against the boss. And they were friendly to the International of Lenin and Trotsky.
Wrap up, comrades.
Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. If you want to be part of this struggle to build a revolutionary party, join Socialist Action in the United States and SA Canada.
Thank you, Jeff. Okay, so I'd like to give a special thanks to Bryan, Jeff, Suzanne, and of course to Kurt, our technical producer in Mississauga. Please consider being a supporter of Socialist Action newspaper, which we will send to you online to fill out the form. Just visit our website at www.socialistaction.ca. That's www.socialistaction.ca. And if you would like to talk to us about joining SA, write to socialistaction@gmail.com or just call us at 647-986-1917, 647-986-1917. And once again, folks, if you like this show, please subscribe to this Socialist Action YouTube channel. The next SA webcast will be on Friday, not on Thursday. You're used to seeing us on Thursday. The next webcast will be on Friday, April the 30th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Socialist Action will host its 35th annual celebration of International Workers' Day. It will be a cultural, political event with speeches by John Clark, Zahia El-Marri, Dirka Prout, Barry Weisletter, Chris Thompson, Hannah Liesnick, Florencia Shea, Jeff Mackler, and we have music by Hutcha, Ken Barrett and the Special Interest Group, Glenn Ornblast, Y.C. Lee, Sandra Griffith Bonaparte, and Emily Sears. So it should be a good time for everybody. Lots of good music as well as speakers. And don't forget, folks, on Saturday, May 1st at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, SA will participate with many labor and socialist partners in a mass online rally to mark Workers' Day. We will send a link for that event to all our e-lists. But don't miss the SA's 35th annual celebration on Friday, April the 30th at 7 p.m. In the meantime, please stay